Welcome to the NCO Journal Podcast. This is a podcast series where we discuss published articles with authors and provide a forum for the open exchange of ideas, information, and solutions. I'm your host, Staff Sergeant Brandon Cox, Senior Editor of the NCO Journal. With us is Chago Zapata, the Managing Editor, and Sergeant First Class Osvaldo Akite, NCOIC. Today we discuss the article, Why You Should Reinvent the Wheel, by Colonel Todd Schmidt, Director of the Army University Press. Before we kick things off, could you please tell us a bit about yourself?
So my name is Colonel Todd Schmidt. I'm the Director of Army University Press, and I've been in the military on active duty now for almost 30 years. I've started out in light infantry divisions as an air defender, worked in the Pentagon for several years, back out to the operational force with Patriots, multiple deployments from Afghanistan across the Middle East, specifically with our Gulf Cooperation Council partners. But the last year and a half here at Army University Press.
What gave you the inspiration to write this article, sir?
So that's an interesting question because the article was really me venting about having been told not to reinvent the wheel. And as I was venting, I thought I need to write this down because I think it is important to actually think about reinventing the wheel and how we approach problems and challenges, how we try to come up with solutions or take a different approach to some of the things that we're asked to do, some of the challenges that we're required to confront.
Yeah. And your article started with a great analogy. You're talking about the wheel, basically why it was created for practical purposes like farming and irrigation and stuff like that, but was later reinvented for purposes like transportation. And that analogy really relates to the idiom that we've often heard that you state, don't reinvent the wheel. How many times do you think you've heard that in your career so far?
Countless. I've probably heard that. Well, it's countless number of times because if you think about it in your career for me, right, from second lieutenant all the way up to colonel, how many times have we been told, hey, just do it this way. Don't try to reinvent the wheel. I've probably been told that by my parents. I've probably been told that by my wife. I've been told that by my friends, let alone in our professional life and kind of our everyday duties. Don't reinvent the wheel.
But that comes from somewhere, right, sir? So maybe we can talk a little bit about where that comes from and why it's so many people have said that before.
Well, you're right, and I think I tried to address it in the article, and that is there needs to be a way to do things. There are some things where you don't want to reinvent the wheel, that procedures, standard operating procedures, tactics, techniques, and procedures that have been learned over and over and over again that we know, hey, this way works, this way saves lives, this way of doing things saves resources. There is a reason why they say don't reinvent the wheel. But all too often it can be an approach that sometimes leaders might take because they're trying to avoid risk rather than mitigate risk. And the point that I try to make in the article is, yes, there is a reason to not reinvent the wheel, but don't let it become your philosophy for every challenge you face.
There's other common sayings, that are common in the Army as far as what some NCOs say, because that's the way it's always been done. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Just get the job done. Right? These are common sayings, common phrases that are bandied about. But we're coming to a place now where multi-domain, large-scale combat operations, they're the near-peer adversaries, what's happening in Ukraine, all these things are happening. And I think it's important that NCOs be flexible and think outside the box and think of different ways, more imaginative ways, more and reinvent the wheel in certain cases because it's important to do it. I think while they're in training, so that they're more adaptive when they're in combat. So reinventing the wheel, I think that's why I thought it was important that we publish your article, sir, because I thought it carries. It's a small, short story, but it carries a powerful message that I think NCOs should really take heed.
Well, first I want to say I really appreciate and am thankful for Joe Byerly, who runs From the Green Notebook, who published it. When he read it, I asked him to review it, actually, to take a look at it, see what he thought, and he asked if he could publish it originally. And so I appreciate what they did to kind of get it out there, get the message out there, and then to have it republished by the NCO Journal, of course, I'm very appreciative of. But to your point, another idiom, right? We're throwing all these out there. Necessity is the mother of invention, right? Never underestimate the ingenuity of a soldier or service member, military service member. Doesn't have to be a soldier. Never underestimate the ingenuity of somebody in crisis, somebody in need, somebody that's looking for a solution, because maybe lives are on the line. I mean, when you think about how in World War II, right, when we were facing the bocage in Europe and our tanks and our leaders didn't have any idea of how to break through the hedgerows. And some soldier thought, well, why don't we just put a plow on the front of a tank to break through these hedges? What a solution that was, right? That saved lives. Instead of having to have infantry storm through and break through hedgerows and be ambushed or be overcome by some hidden machine gun nest, to put the tanks forward with a shovel on the front to break through those hedgerows. That soldier's invention of putting the plow on the front of a tank, that spread throughout his unit, through his division, through the Corps, because it was such ingenious solution to a problem that the Army was facing. That's why, reinventing the wheel, whether it's at the tactical level, operational level, or strategic level, it's important that we never give up or we never stop trying to think about challenges in a new light, from a different perspective, with different personality, in different generations, right? We've got young soldiers coming in now that think differently, that grew up differently, and they're going to solve problems differently. And we need to not always assume that the old way is the best way. Now, in some instances, it may be, but we don't want to negate what a fresh perspective from a fresh generation can bring.
What do you think leaders? Maybe start off with the strategic level and then get all the way down to the tactical level and talk about what leaders can do to kind of help foster that or spark that creative thinking when they're in training, or maybe just the way they run their units.
So I think what leaders should do at all levels is to accept risk judiciously. Think through risk, think through how to mitigate it, but always be willing to take risk, to provide overhead cover for your team to think through the challenges that they're confronted with. If a leader's not willing to accept risk, if a leader's not willing to provide overhead cover, then you will get units or a command climate where nobody thinks anew. They just dust off solutions that may have already been on the bookshelf instead of looking at something with fresh eyes, because they don't want to take the risk, because they know that the boss isn't willing to take the risk. And if the boss isn't willing to take a risk for fear of failure, that affects unit climate, command climate. It affects how people approach problems and solutions. So whether it's at the strategic level, operational level, or tactical level, leaders that are willing to take mitigated risk or provide that overhead cover for their team to confront the challenges that they face, I think that demonstrates a leader that understands the importance of a team needing to find solutions that are fresh.
I guess reading your article from the enlisted or NCO perspective, what I took out of it as was your status quo, right? Keeping everything the way they should be, don't change it. That's the standard, right? I'm thinking about it from the NCO perspective as, well, we can always add a little bit to it, right? So my example would be is if you're running a lane and you have a soldier down, and this is all notional, but you put him on a gurney and say, hey, he needs to get medevac, take him to the bird. Well, you could just have him do that in a straight line and check the box. Or you could say, hey, good job, you picked him up. Now this guy just got shot. Now what do you do? I think adding some things like that as an NCO makes it more realistic, makes it more challenging and makes the soldiers think critically to provide a creative solution. I think that's kind of what you were getting at least from when I read it.
Well, first of all, I agree with you. If we're just giving simple problems that soldiers know that they're going to be confronted with in a training lane, and we're taking away the complexity or the opportunity to introduce complexity that requires that creative thinking, then we're not doing justice to our soldiers. Because that scenario that you just outlined, it would be easy to just check the block, right? We met the training requirement, task condition standards, we're good to go. But if we're not testing or challenging our soldiers to think critically through complex, complicated problems, the ones that we know they'll face in a more forward deployed environment or an expeditionary environment, then we're not doing them justice, because critical thinking skills don't just appear out of necessity when a firefight starts. Critical thinking skills get developed over time with training and education. And so that's why it's so critical, I think, when we think about professional education, professional military education, professional development, all the schools that we go to, it's so important to make sure that our soldiers get those opportunities, because it's constant. It's like a muscle, right? You want to keep exercising those critical thinking skills over and over again throughout your career at every stage, so that you can think about how to reinvent the wheel and come up with better solutions to problems that we've faced over time.
As I was reading your article, sir, one of the things that kept popping up in my head was tell soldiers what you need to get done. Just don't tell them how to do it. That's kind of my my takeaway from your article, and then maybe that's kind of where I was looking at it from an NCO's perspective. Is that a lot of times we try to tell soldiers how to do something, or we rely on them knowing some, like you said, some TTPs and understanding some doctrine and things like that. But sometimes we need to just give them a left and right limit and let them go and try to figure some things out on their own. What do you think about that?
I think you've just described what we call mission command. You almost described it to a T, because it's about a leader giving a subordinate a mission, left and right limits, required resources, a desired end state. This is what I want to see at the end, but I'm not going to tell you how to get there. I'll give you, some parameters and the resources, like I just said, and I'll tell you what I want to see at the end, but it's up to you to get to that desired end state. That's what we call mission command. And it's that trust that leaders have to have in their subordinates, and their subordinates have to have in their leadership. It's a two-way street. For mission command to work the way that you described it, there's got to be trust on both ends of the spectrum for that to work.
Sir, you talk a little bit about in your article about rule followers versus rule breakers. I found it very interesting. Can you explain your take between the two?
Yeah, I think for those of us in the military, we know at the end of the day, we follow orders, right? We follow orders. So in that sense and from that perspective, we are institutionally and culturally, we are rule followers. And that's important. That discipline is important in a military and in the Army and in the jobs that we do. But when I talk about rule breakers, what I'm really referring to, and I think I might have even used the term in the article, and that is mavericks, right? Because if everybody's a rule follower, if nobody's thinking creatively, and everybody's just following the leader, that's where you have situations where, you ever read the story about the emperor who had no clothes? Nobody wanted to tell the emperor he had no clothes. Nobody wanted to be the rule breaker that went against the group think. And I think what happens a lot of times is we have group think, we get group think in different situations because it's easier. It's an easier way to deal with problems. And if we don't have those mavericks, if we don't have those people that are willing to disagree with the group or offer a devil's advocate position or to red team a plan, if we don't have that, let's call them rule breakers. If we don't have that, let's call them mavericks. If we don't have that devil's advocate, then we have the challenge of groupthink, and we have that negative impact of nobody wanting to take a fresh look at challenges we face, whether it's at the tactical level, operational level, or strategic level. And by having folks, sometimes it's a designated role, right? You might designate people to be the red team. You might designate people to play devil's advocate because we want to think through what are some of the holes that we can punch in our plan, where are some of the ways that we might fail. If everybody's just agreeing and nobody's thinking out of the box and nobody's trying to figure out how a plan might fail, then that in itself creates its own risk. And so that's what I really mean when I talk about mavericks and rule breakers. And I talk about the conversation that I had with my friend where, in peacetime it's the rule followers that might be more successful, but in wartime it's the mavericks and the rule breakers that might be more successful because they're in the heat of battle, right? And like I mentioned before, it's necessity is the mother of invention. And I think it's important to understand that if we're in a garrison environment where risk guides everything that we do, we may need to rethink our approach.
I was wondering, sir, if you could tell us a story. You've been a leader for many years in many different positions. I was wondering if you had an example or something you lived through, maybe where you had that fear of making a change and then maybe you took it. Was there an outcome there?
So you want to hear a story. If your question is to tell you a story where I think I might have taken risk, whether mitigated or prudent, I'll leave that to the listener. But as a Patriot Battalion commander, my philosophy, particularly while deployed, was that I wanted my Patriot batteries, I wanted my soldiers, I wanted my teams to train with live ammunition. Now, it's a different ball game training with live ammunition in a Patriot unit than it is in an infantry unit. I would argue a Patriot missile costs millions of dollars. So having an accident with a Patriot missile is an international event. And if you just look at the news, you can see where somebody launched a Patriot missile by accident, maybe in Qatar or some other location where a Patriot misfire occurred and it becomes an international event. All that aside, I was still adamant that my units train with live ammunition, train with live Patriot missiles. And we did have an incident, in fact, where a team was racing back from downfield from having done a Patriot reload drill, coming back to the rear with a missile that was not locked in its canister correctly. And when the HEMTT came to a stop, that missile slipped forward and poked through the canister where you could see the cone of the missile. It was an unfortunate accident. Nobody was hurt. The missile had to be recertified, but it wasn't taken out of the fight. There was a 15-6, but I'm the one that took responsibility because it was my direction that my units train with live ammunition. And so, I took risk. I don't regret it. I don't think that in the big scheme of things, I think there was more benefit in building the confidence and proficiency of my teams. I think there was more benefit than negative impact by my soldiers training with live Patriot missiles than this one incident that occurred where it might have caused a ruckus up the chain of command, and I may have gotten called on the carpet by a 06 brigade commander. I may have been called on the carpet by a 2-star general. But in the end, to me, it was worth it. Having the opportunity to do it all over again, I would still require my soldiers while deployed to train with live ammunition.
When you're framing it that way, it's clear that the biggest risk is not letting, soldiers reinvent the wheel, take the initiative, and do these things. The problem is people don't get to that point where they get to frame it that way unless they definitely see the benefit to what they're doing or the risk that they're underwriting. In your instance, live ammunition does so much for a unit. It's the fact that I can go into a room, shoot 3 inches in front of somebody else's barrel and be okay with it, and adrenaline's rushing with no rest. It brings it elevates the expertise and confidence of a unit. And I think it would do the same thing for a Patriot unit. And so the benefit to that is just extremely, it just overshadows whatever the risk is.
Well, there's people out there who might disagree with you, and that's okay. But I think one of the things you were talking about, though, and I think it's important, is it's important that leaders underwrite the risk. It's important that leaders provide an environment where soldiers can think about things from a fresh perspective, with a different point of view, where they're able to collaborate and say, how could we do this differently? What's a better way to do this? How do we build a better mousetrap, right? And give them the time, the resources, and the overhead cover to do it. And the command climate that I think that comes out of that is so much healthier than the unit where there's, it's super hierarchical, which is part of being in the military. But if a command team or if leaders try to rule with an iron fist and they squash any initiative because, you know what, I'm only in command or I'm only in position for this certain amount of time and I don't want anything going wrong on my watch. That approach to me is so stifling and so unhealthy, and I think it impacts how soldiers see their time in the Army. They don't want that stifling environment. They want to serve their country, to do the best that they can, but they also want to take their swing at it, right? They want to get in the box and they want to take a swing and they want to look at the challenges that have been faced for millennia by soldiers, right? But every generation is different, and they're going to look at problems differently. And if you don't allow soldiers to take initiative, to reinvent the wheel, you'll find that the ranks will start to thin because that's not a climate that they'll want to be in.
From the enlisted perspective, training like you fight is the way we should train. So keeping it as realistic as possible makes it more serious, makes soldiers take it more serious. They respect it. I think that it creates more of a window to learn. And I'll tell you, so I was aviation for a long time, and we would consistently train DART missions down to aircraft recovery teams. And what we would do to check the box was you grab your equipment, you'd head out to a Humvee, and you got to a site where there would be an invisible helicopter, right? And then your team would assess battle damage, and then you would make necessary repairs or blow it in place, and then leave. And I was for years just saying, like, why don't we just really do this? Like, why? They're like, well, it's money, I was like, well, I mean, how about when we go out to the field, we like really do something? So I don't know. I had a cool commander at the time, I guess. He was actually the pilot for that DART, and he flew it about a mile away. And we took another bird, as you really would, and we went over there and we fixed it. It took about an hour, and it was awesome. And everybody got a great experience out of it. We had a real perimeter of people pulling security. It was real. And then about 2 years after that, I really did pull a DART mission in Kuwait, and it was very identical. So I had that realistic experience before I really did it, and I think that helped a lot. So I guess my question would be, what would you say to those junior commanders who are in fear of taking some risk to provide a better training experience for their soldiers?
So for leaders who want to take prudent risk to provide realistic training for their soldiers, it can depend on the unit you're in. It can depend on the command climate. It could depend on their own level of experience. If a junior leader comes in and wants to try something new right off the bat, not having earned the trust and confidence of his leaders because they're just brand new to the unit, in my mind, a lot of risk mitigation or prudent risk can be taken because of trust built over time, of personal relationships that develop through repetitive training. And you don't just go straight into a live fire, right? You don't just go straight into some complex, complicated training event that might be it might be cutting edge. It might be something that's never been done before. To get to that, you have to have built trust and confidence in the team over time. It's not just something that, you land fresh in a unit and then all of a sudden you're doing something that's cutting edge. I would imagine there's got to be some time where some trust is built with the team, with the senior commander, with the more junior leaders, because trust and personal relationships are what help those sorts of training events be successful. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's about making sure it's not just reinventing the wheel for reinventing the wheel's sake. When you want to take a new approach to something and it's challenging and it's complex and it could be costly if mistakes are made, it's important that team be a well-oiled machine with trust and confidence and relationships, that they know that they can depend on one another. They know how each other thinks. They know, that the team is going to work together and for the good of the unit, that sort of thing. If you throw a new team together and put them into a complex, complicated situation where there is a lot of risk, you might have some sort of catastrophic failure that could have been mitigated had the team had more time to build trust and confidence in one another.
Well, that's where I think the NCO comes into play, because commanders might come to a unit, they're only there for a few, maybe 2 years max, but you have some NCOs that might be in a unit for 3 years and things like that. So, first sergeants that have been doing training and platoon sergeants that have been leading and have been working with soldiers for a while, and I think that's where the NCOs can quickly help a commander gain trust in their unit because of the competence that they demonstrate and what the training that they've done and what they communicate to that officer, and say, yeah, we're willing, we're able to do this. We've been training on doing this, and then you can see that professionalism come out in that NCO. Then it makes it a little bit easier for that officer to trust that, and then maybe take that mitigated risk.
100%.
Sir, knowing everything that you've learned throughout your career, now a colonel in the United States Army, what advice would you give yourself as a newly minted lieutenant?
As a newly minted lieutenant, with the experience that I have now, kind of looking back, right, hindsight being 20/20, some things that I would do differently, I would have spent more time with my soldiers. I felt I got to know, as a second lieutenant, as a first lieutenant, even as a company commander, I got to know my soldiers pretty well, particularly my NCOs. But looking back, having the opportunity to do it all over again, I would have doubled down on that. And I would have spent less time worrying about how responsive I was on my email. I would have spent less time worrying about what was coming into my BlackBerry. And I would have put that all to the side, because there was nothing coming into my email inbox and there was nothing hitting my BlackBerry that was so important as to take me away from getting to learn more about this soldier or that soldier or this family or that family or this NCO or that NCO. I probably would have spent less time on my technology and more time face-to-face with soldiers. That's probably the biggest thing I would share with Second Lieutenant Todd Schmidt, knowing what I know now. But that's a pretty big one.
By the way, for those of you who don't know, BlackBerry is a device that used to have little buttons in it to press the text. It's an ancient device that was once used by everyone.
Thanks, Chago.
I used to have one too, sir. I don't know why they disappeared, but...
Thank you, sir, for joining us, and a thank you to our audience. Remember to put your knowledge to the page, submit articles, and get published with the NCO Journal. Don't forget to check out our webpage and follow us on social media. We'll catch you next time on the NCO Journal Podcast.